So, Lone Rider here, and this is sort of an unboxing video, something that's fairly new to me. And this is, well, let's just see what it is. Using my little homemade dagger here. Right. I've been waiting several days for this. It's actually a birthday present of sorts. Packing information. Packing materials. I like that they didn't use styrofoam this time. And here we go. Okay. All right. So, what we have here is a sword. Big surprise there. Let me remove this. I got this tag on here. Let me take that off. We have a nice leather grip. Synthetic scabbard, which is not a surprise. All right. There we go. Ooh, wow. Okay, that's pretty darn cool. All right. Now this is the Hanwei Practical Norman Sword, and this is kind of my birthday present. This is, how do we say? This is a blunt sword, so suitable for training, HEMA, that sort of thing. And this is Brazil nut pommel, slightly curved crossguard, wide fuller blade. This is basically, they call it a Norman sword. It would be also accurate, I guess, to kind of put it in the role of a late Viking period sword. And this is a one-handed sword. I don't actually have a proper one-handed sword. I made a couple mock-ups at a mild steel, one of which was actually sharp enough to cut milk jugs. But I don't have a properly manufactured and tempered and flexible sword, which this is. In fact, I've been told that this particular one, well, everything I've been told about it actually seems to add up. I've been told that it had a grip of approximately the right length. A lot of times swords from this period, they make the grips too long. These grips generally weren't as confining as Viking era grips, which tended to be much shorter, but they were fairly short compared to later period grips, and that's something that I definitely see here. You have a more or less parallel blade. It does taper this way slightly, but it's pretty straight, and then it rounds towards the tip. The tip, of course, being blunt and rounded, fits with it being a practice sword rather than a sharp cutting sword. And you have a fairly wide edge that's not beveled in any way. So, yeah, this is in many ways comparable to my my long sword in terms of construction, except for the lack of a fuller. And here we go. Now my long sword obviously has a much longer grip, but it has a fairly short blade, as you can see. So the blade on this is supposed to be 30 inches long. The blade on the long sword is just under 32 inches. So that actually is fitting. This long sword is, properly speaking, a bastard sword. It's actually, it's essentially a blade that's slightly longer than a normal one-handed sword on a two-handed sword hilt. But this is what I have to practice longsword. So I've never had a a proper one-handed sword, and now I do, and that's pretty cool. Um, let's see here. So we have our scabbard. Um, there we go. This is a synthetic material, and it actually does a pretty good job of holding the sword in there. There's a chape on the end, but if you look at the end of the scabbard, the chape actually does not, a metal chape rather, but if you notice, it ends there. It doesn't overlap the top, so the blade isn't contacting with that, so that's not going to cause any scratches. Obviously, dulling's not an issue with a blunt sword. Normally, the problem with having a metal chape on a scabbard, if the edges of the metal chape fold over the top, is that you don't want the blade to rub against that and dull every time you take it in and out. That's not going to be an issue on this because, well, it's a dull sword to start with. It doesn't have an edge. But yeah, this is pretty damn cool. I'm liking it. So we have two hanging rings here on the scabbard. Let's see, the grip is leather wrapped, and ooh, I'm not actually all that happy about that. It's actually split. So it looks like this was never sewed. It looks like this was just glued. And I don't know if you can see that. There's a gap there. Now that's not a problem. I may just decide to wrap the grip with wire or something. We'll see. But that is definitely, it's coming apart when it arrives. That's never good. The pommel is peened, and it's a fairly rough peen, but that's not a problem. In my opinion, you're dealing with a sparring sword, so this isn't supposed to be a work of art. I wish the peen wasn't quite so rough looking, but it's not bad. I could probably sand that down actually. The cross guard is well shaped. It's not too long. It's fairly short, and it is wider where it goes around the blade. And then, of course, it tapers down near the end, so it doesn't have to be as long. I like that it has a slightly forward curvature. Well, aesthetically, I do like straight crossguards. This just adds a little bit of variety to the sword. And then there's a bit of a gap around where the blade goes in. Not so much because of the blade, but because of the wide fuller there. And I've actually never seen a sword where the fuller went all the way to the hilt where there wasn't a gap. The only time there isn't some kind of a gap accounted for by the fuller is when there isn't a fuller. Now, I don't know why they don't just make the cut in the guard so that it dips down on each side where the fuller is, but presumably, at least for an inexpensive mass-produced sword, that would be asking a little too much. So, now like I said, I'm not very happy with the way this grip is, basically opening up already. I'm not entirely sure what I'll do with that. I may try to stitch it closed. I may try to give it some kind of a wrapping. It looks like to me what they did is they just, they glued it and then they wrapped something around it to hold it, and then they took that wrapping off. And well, it's fairly intact up here. Down here you can see the slit is actually opening, and it's wide enough to get a fingernail in there. So that's not good at all. But if you leave aside the grip wrapping, the sword is not bad. I expected a little more distal taper. This appears to have distal taper, but it doesn't appear to have much. Now, it was listed on the website as having distal taper, but again, I don't know. It looks like it could do with more. And the point of balance is about here, as you can see. So now I'm happy to have this. I haven't had a one-handed sword before, but like I said, the grip is, that's barely acceptable, and God knows how long it'll last. And I wish the finish on the pommel wasn't quite as rough. It's almost like they literally did nothing. It's like they just peened it and left it there. So that, maybe I'll try and sand that out. But other than that, This is a pretty funky, pretty cool sword. Flexibility wise, it's not all that flexible, but then again, neither is my longsword if you think about it. So oh, I'm glad to have it. I mean, I didn't have a one-handed sword before. Now I finally do. And the main thing is the grip proportions are appropriate. The guard is pretty good and the pommel's pretty good. And everything's solid, of course. So, this is a pretty neat thing to have. Some nits to pick as far as finishing. I mean, that grip is really, I don't know what they were thinking. But, beyond that, this is pretty good. So there you go. That's the Hanwei Tinker Practical Norman Sword. And there we go. Lone Rider out.